An excerpt from a Catechetical Discourse by St. Gregory of Nyssa, written in 383 A.D. For since man is the work and image of God, who through his goodness brought this creature into being, no one could reasonably suspect that he of whose constitution goodness is the cause was created by his Maker in the midst of evil. But there is another reason for our present circumstances being what they are, and for our being destitute of the primitive surroundings. And yet again, the starting point of our answer to this argument against us is not beyond and outside the assent of our opponents. For he who made man for the participation of his own peculiar good, and incorporated him the instincts for all that was excellent, in order that his desire might be carried forward by a corresponding movement, in each case to its like, would never have deprived him of that most excellent and precious of all goods. I mean the gift implied in being his own master, and having a free will. For if necessity in any way was the master of the life of man, the image would have been falsified in that particular part, by being estranged owing to this unlikeness to its archetype. How can that nature which is under a yoke and bondage to any kind of necessity be called an image of a master being? Was it not then most right that which in every detail, made like the divine, should possess in its nature a self-ruling and independent principle, such as to enable the participation of good to be the reward of its virtue? Whence then comes it, you will ask, that he who had been distinguished throughout with most excellent endowments exchanged these good things for the worse? The reason of this also is plain. No growth of evil had its beginning in the divine will. Vice would have been blameless were it inscribed with the name of God as its maker and father. But the evil is in some way or other engendered from within, springing up in the will at that moment when there is a retrocession of the soul from the beautiful. For as sight is an activity of nature, and blindness a deprivation of that natural operation, such is the kind of opposition between virtue and vice. It is in fact not possible to form any other notion of the origin of vice than as the absence of virtue. For as when the light has been removed, the darkness supervenes, but as long as it is present there is no darkness. So as long as the good is present in the nature, vice is a thing that has no inherent existence, while the departure of the better state becomes the origin of its opposite. Since then this is the peculiarity of the possession of a free will, that it chooses as it likes the thing that it pleases, you will find that it is not God who is the author of the present evils, seeing that he has ordered your nature so as to be its own master and free, but rather the recklessness that makes choice of the worse in preference to the better. But you will perhaps seek to know the cause of this error of judgment, for it is to this point that the train of our discussion tends. Again, then, we shall be justified in expecting to find some starting point which will throw light on this inquiry also. An argument such as the following we have received by tradition from the Fathers, and this argument is no mere mythical narrative, but one that naturally invites our credence. Of all existing things there is a twofold manner of apprehension, the consideration of them being divided between what appertains to intellect and what appertains to the senses. And besides these there is nothing to be detected in the nature of existing things, as extending beyond this division. Now these two worlds have been separated from each other by a wide interval, so that the sensible is not included in those qualities which mark the intellectual, nor this last in those qualities which distinguish the sensible, but each receives its formal character from qualities opposite to those of the other. The world of thought is bodiless, impalpable, and figureless, but the sensible is, by its very name, bounded by those perceptions which come through the organs of sense. But as in the sensible word itself, though there is a considerable mutual opposition of its various elements, yet a certain harmony maintained in those opposites has been devised by the wisdom that rules the universe, and thus there is produced a concord of the whole creation with itself, and the natural contrariety does not break the chain of agreement. In like manner, owing to the divine wisdom, there is an admixture and interpenetration of the sensible with the intellectual department, in order that all things may equally have a share in the beautiful, and no single one of existing things be without its share in that superior world. For this reason, the corresponding locality of the intellectual world is a subtle and mobile essence, which in accordance with its supermundane habitation, has in its peculiar nature large affinity with the intellectual part. Now by a provision of the supreme mind, there is an intermixture of the intellectual with the sensible world, in order that nothing in creation may be thrown aside. as worthless, as says the Apostle, or be left without its portion of the divine fellowship. On this account, it is that commixture of the intellectual and sensible in man is effected by the divine being, as the description of the cosmogony instructs us. It tells us that God, taking dust of the ground, formed the man, and by an inspiration from himself he planted life in the work of his hand, that thus the earthly might be raised up to the divine, and so one certain grace of equal value might pervade the whole creation, the lower nature being mingled with the supermundane. Since then the intellectual nature had a previous existence, and to each of the angelic powers a certain operation was assigned, for the organization of the whole. By the authority that presides over all things, there was a certain power ordained to hold together and sway the earthly region constituted for this purpose by the power that administers the universe. Upon that there was fashioned that thing, molded of earth, an image copied from the superior power. Now this living being was man. In him, by ineffable influence, the godlike beauty of the intellectual nature was mingled. He to whom the administration of the earth has been consigned takes it ill, and thinks it not to be borne, if of that nature which has been subjected to him any being shall be exhibited bearing likeness to his transcendent dignity. But the question how one who had been created for no evil purpose by him who framed the system of the universe in goodness fell away, nevertheless, into this passion of envy, it is not a part of my present business minutely to discuss, though it would not be difficult, and it would not take long, to offer an account of those who are amenable to persuasion. For the distinctive difference between virtue and vice is not to be contemplated as that between two actually subsisting phenomena, but as there is a logical opposition between that which is and that which is not, and it is not possible to say that, as regards subsistency, that which is not is distinguished from that which is, but we say that nonentity is only logically opposed to entity. In the same way also the word vice is opposed to the word virtue, not as being in any existence in itself, but only as becoming thinkable by the absence of the better. As we say, that blindness is logically opposed to sight, not that blindness has of itself a natural existence, being only a deprivation of a preceding faculty, so also we say that vice is to be regarded as the deprivation of goodness, just as a shadow which supervenes at the passage of the solar ray. Since then the uncreated nature is incapable of admitting such movement as is implied in turning or change or alteration, while everything that subsists through creation has connection with change, inasmuch as the subsistence itself of the creation had its rise in change, that which was not passing by the divine power into that which is, and since the above-mentioned power was created too, and could choose by a spontaneous movement whatever he liked, when he had closed his eyes to the good, and the ungrudging like one who in the sunshine let his eyelids down upon his eyes sees only darkness, in this way that being also, by his very unwillingness to perceive the good, became cognizant of the contrary to goodness. Now this is envy. Well, it is undeniable that the beginning of any matter is the cause of everything else that by consequence follows upon it. For instance, upon health there follows a good habit of body, activity, and a pleasurable life. But upon sickness, weakness, want of energy, and life passed in distaste of everything. And so in all other instances things follow by consequence their proper beginnings. As then freedom from the agitation of the passions is the beginning and groundwork of a life in accordance with virtue, so the bias to vice generated by that envy is the constituted road to all these evils, which have been since displayed. For when once he, who by his apostasy from goodness had begotten in himself this envy, had received this bias to evil, like a rock torn asunder from a mountain ridge, which is driven down headlong by its own weight, in like manner he dragged away from his original natural propension to goodness, and gravitating with all his weight in the direction of vice, was deliberately forced and borne away, as by a kind of gravitation, to the utmost limit of iniquity. And as for that intellectual power which he had received from his Creator, to co-operate with the better endowments, this he made his assisting instrument in the discovery of contrivances for the purposes of vice, while by his crafty skill he deceives and circumvents man, persuading him to become his own murderer with his own hands. For seeing that man, by the commission of the divine blessing, had been elevated to a lofty preeminence, for he was appointed king over the earth and all things on it, he was beautiful in his form, being created an image of the archetypal beauty. He was without passion in his nature, for he was an imitation of the unimpassioned. He was full of frankness, delighting in a face-to-face manifestation of the personal deity. All this was to the adversary the fuel to his passion of envy. Yet could he not by any exercise of strength or dint or force accomplish his purpose? For the strength of God's blessing overmastered his own force. His plan, therefore, is to withdraw man from this enabling strength, that thus he may be easily captured by him and open to his treachery. As in a lamp, when the flame has caught the wick, and a person is unable to blow it out, he mixes water with the oil, and by this devices will dull the flame. In the same way, the enemy, by craftily mixing up badness in man's will, has produced a kind of extinguishment and dullness in the blessing, on the failure of which that which is opposed necessarily enters. For to life is opposed death, to strength weakness, to blessing curse, to frankness shame, and to all that is good, whatever can be conceived is opposite. Thus it is that humanity is in its present evil condition, since that beginning introduced the occasions for such an ending. Yet let no one ask, how was it that if God foresaw the misfortune that would happen to man from want of thought, he came to create him, since it was perhaps more to his advantage not to have been born than to be in the midst of such evils? This is what they who have been carried away by the false teaching of the Manichees put forward for the establishment of their error, as thus able to show that the creator of human nature is evil. For if God is not ignorant of anything, that is, and yet man is in the midst of evil, the argument for the goodness of God could not be upheld. That is, if he brought forth into life the man who was to be in this evil. For if the operating force which is in accordance with the good is entirely that of a nature which is good, then this painful and perishing life, they say, can never be referred to the workmanship of the good. But it is necessary to suppose for such a life as this another author, from whom our nature derives its tendency to misery. Now all these and the like assertions seem to be who are thoroughly imbued with the heretical fraud, as with some deeply ingrained stain, to have a certain force from their superficial plausibility. But they who have a more thorough insight into the truth clearly perceive what they say is unsound, and admits of speedy demonstration of its fallacy. In my opinion, too, it is well to put forward the apostle as pleading with us on these points for their condemnation. In his address to the Corinthians, he makes a distinction between the carnal and spiritual dispositions of souls, showing, I think, by what he says, that it is wrong to judge of what is morally excellent, or on the other hand of what is evil, by the standard of the senses, but that by withdrawing the mind from bodily phenomena, we must decide by itself and from itself the true nature of moral excellence and of its opposite. The spiritual man, he says, judgeth all things. This, I think, must have been the reason of the invention of these deceptive doctrines on the part of those who propound them, that when they define the good, they have an eye only to the sweetness of the body's enjoyment. And so, because from its composite nature and constant tendency to dissolution, that body is unavoidably subject to suffering and sicknesses, and because upon such conditions of suffering there follows a sort of sense of pain, they decree that the formation of man is the work of an evil deity. Since if their thoughts had taken a loftier view, and withdrawing their minds from this disposition to regard the gratification of the senses, they had looked at the nature of existing things dispassionately, they would have understood that there is no evil other than wickedness. Now all wickedness had its form and character in the deprivation of the good. It exists not by itself, and cannot be contemplated as a subsistence, for no evil of any kind lies outside and independent of the will, but it is the non-existence of the good that is so denominated. Now that which is not has no substantial existence, and the maker of that which has no substantial existence is not the maker of things that have substantial existence. Therefore, the God of things that are is external to the causation of things that are evil, since he is not the maker of things that are non-existent. He who formed the sight did not make blindness. He who manifested virtue manifested not the deprivation thereof. He who has proposed as the prize in the contest of the free will, the guerdon of all good to those who are living virtuously, never to please himself, subjected mankind to the yoke of a strong compulsion as if he would drag it unwilling, as it were his lifeless tool towards the right. But if when the light shines very brightly in a clear sky, a man of his own accord shuts his eyelids to shade his sight, the sun is clear of blame on the part of him who sees not. Nevertheless, one who regards only the dissolution of the body is greatly disturbed, and makes it a hardship that this life of ours should be dissolved by death. It is, he says, the extremity of evil that our being should be quenched by this condition of mortality. Let him then observe through this gloomy prospect the excess of the divine benevolence. He may by this perhaps be the more induced to admire the graciousness of God's care for the affairs of man. To live is desirable to those who partake of life, on account of the enjoyment of things to their mind. Since if anyone lives in bodily pain, Not to be is deemed by such a one more desirable than to exist in pain. Let us inquire, then, whether he who gives us our outfit for living has any other object in view than how we may pass our life under the fairest circumstances. Now, since by a motion of our self-will we contracted a fellowship with evil, and owing to some sensual gratification mixed up this evil with our nature like some deleterious ingredient, spoiling the taste of honey, and so falling away from that blessedness which is involved in the thought of passionlessness, we have been viciously transformed. For this reason, man is resolved again into the dust of the ground, in order to secure that he may part with the soil which he has now contracted, and that he may, through the resurrection, be reformed anew after the original pattern, at least if in this life, then that now, if he has preserved what belongs to that image. A doctrine such as this is set before us by Moses under the disguise of an historical manner, and yet this disguise of history contains a teaching which is most plain. For after, as he tells us, the earliest of mankind were brought into contact with what was forbidden, and thereby were stripped naked of that primal blessed condition, the Lord clothed these, his first-formed creatures, with coats of skins. In my opinion, we are not bound to take these skins in their literal meaning. For to what sort of slain and flayed animals did this clothing devised for these humanities belong? But since all skin, after it is separated from the animal, is dead, I am certainly of opinion that he who is the healer of our sinfulness, of his foresight invested man subsequently with that capacity of dying, which had been the special attribute of the brute creation. Not that it was to last forever, for a coat is something external put on us, lending itself to the body for a time, but not indigenous to its nature. This liability to death, then, taken from the brute creation, was provisionally made to envelop the nature created for immortality. It enwrapped it externally, but not internally. It grasped the sentient part of man, but laid no hold upon the divine image. This sentient part, however, does not disappear, but is dissolved. Disappearance is the passing away into non-existence, but dissolution is the dispersion again into those constituent elements of the world of which it was composed. But that which is contained in them perishes not, though it escapes the cognizance of our senses. Now the causes of this dissolution is evident from the illustration we have given of it. For since the senses have a close connection with what is gross and earthy, while the intellect is in its nature of a nobler and more exalted character than the movements involved in sensation, it follows, as through the estimate which is made by the senses, there is an erroneous judgment as to what is morally good, and this error has wrought the effect of substantiating a contrary condition. That part of us which has thus been made useless is dissolved by its reception of this contrary. Now the bearing of our illustration is as follows. We suppose that some vessel has been composed of clay, and then for some mischief or other, filled with melted lead, which lead hardens and remains in a non-liquid state. Then that the owner of the vessel recovers it, and as he possesses the potter's art, pounds to bits the ware which held the lead, and then remolds the vessel after its former pattern for its own special use, emptied now of the material which had been mixed with it. By a like process, the maker of our vessel, now that wickedness has intermingled with our sentient part, I mean that connected with the body, will dissolve the material which has received the evil, and remolding it again by the resurrection without any admixture of the contrary matter, will recombine the elements into the vessel in its original beauty. Now, since both soul and body have a common bond of fellowship in their participation of the sinful affections, there is also an analogy between the soul's and body's death. For as in regard to the flesh we pronounce the separation of the sentient life to be death, so in respect of the soul we call the departure of the real life death. While then, as we have said before, the participation in evil, observable both in soul and body, is of one and the same character. For it is through both that the evil principle advances into actual working. The death of dissolution which came from that clothing of dead skins does not affect the soul. For how can that which is uncompounded be subject to dissolution? But since there is a necessity that the defilements which sin has engendered in the soul as well should be removed, thence by some remedial process, the medicine which virtue supplies has in the life that it now is been applied to the healing of such mutilations as these. If, however, the soul remains unhealed, the remedy is dispensed in the life that follows this. Now, in the ailments of the body there are sundry differences, some admitting of an easier, others requiring a more difficult treatment. In these last, the use of the knife or cauteries or draughts of bitter medicine are adopted to remove the disease that has attacked the body. For the healing of the soul's sickness, the future judgment announces something of the same kind, and this to the thoughtless sort is held out as the threat of a terrible correction, in order that through fear of this painful retribution they may gain the wisdom of fleeing from wickedness, while by those of more intelligence it is believed to be a remedial process ordered by God to bring back man, his peculiar creature, to the grace of his primal condition. They who use the knife or cautery to remove certain unnatural excrescences in the body, such as wens or warts, do not bring to the person they are serving a method of healing that is painless, though certainly excrescences are hardening on our souls, that have been sensualized by fellowship with the body's affections, are in the day of the judgment, as it were cut and scraped by the ineffable wisdom and power of him who, as the gospel says, healeth those that are sick. For as he says again, they that are whole have no need of the physician, but they that are sick. Since then there has been inbred in the soul a strong natural tendency to evil, it must suffer, just as the excision of a wart gives a sharp pain to the skin of the body. For whatever contrary to the nature has been inbred in the nature attaches itself to the subject in a certain union of feeling, and hence there is produced an abnormal intermixture of our own with an alien quality, so that the feelings, when the separation from this abnormal growth comes, are hurt and lacerated. Thus, when the soul pines and melts away under the correction of its sins, as prophecy somewhere tells us, there necessarily follows from it deep, intimate connection with evil, certain unspeakable and inexpressible pangs, the description of which is as difficult to render as is that of the nature of good things which are the subjects of our hope. For neither the one nor the other is capable of being expressed in words, or brought within reach of the understanding. If then anyone looks to the ultimate aim of the wisdom of him who directs the economy of the universe, he would be very unreasonable and narrow-minded to call the maker of man the author of evil, or to say that he is ignorant of the future, or that if he knows it and has made him, he is not uninfluenced by the impulse to what is bad. He knew what was going to be, yet did not prevent the tendency toward which actually happened. That humanity indeed would be diverted from the good could not be unknown to him who grasps all things by the power of his foresight, and whose eyes behold the coming equally with the past events. As then he had in sight of the perversion, so he devised man's recall to good. Accordingly, which was the better way? Never to have brought our nature into existence at all, since he foresaw that the being about to be created would fall away from that which is morally beautiful, or to bring him back by repentance and restore his diseased nature to its original beauty. But because of the pains and sufferings of the body, which are the necessary accidents of its unstable nature, to call God on that account the maker of evil, or to think that he is not the creator of man at all, in hopes thereby to prevent the supposition of his being the author of what gives us pain, all this is an instance of that extreme narrow-mindedness which is the mark of those who judge of moral good and moral evil by mere sensation. Such persons do not understand that that only is intrinsically good which sensation does not reach, and that the only evil is estrangement from the good. But to make pains and pleasures the criterion of what is morally good, and the contrary, is a characteristic of the unreasoning nature of creatures, in whom, from their want of mind and understanding, the apprehension of real goodness has no place. That man is the work of God, created morally noble and for the noblest destiny, is evident not only from what has been said, but from a vast number of other proofs, which because they are so many we shall here omit. But when we call God the maker of man, we do not forget how carefully at the outset we defined our position against the Greeks. It was there shown that the Word of God is a substantial and personified being, himself both God and the Word, who has embraced in himself all creative power, or rather who is very power with an impulse to all good, who works out effectually whatever he wills by having a power concurrent with his will, whose will and work is the life of all things that exist, by whom too man was brought into being and adored with the highest excellences, after the fashion of deity. But since that alone is unchangeable in its nature, which does not derive its origin through creation, while whatever by the uncreated being is brought into existence out of what was non-existent from the very first moment that it begins to be, is ever passing through change, and if it acts according to its nature, the change is ever to the better. But if it be diverted from the straight path, then a movement to the contrary succeeds. Since I say man was thus conditioned, and in him the changeable element in his nature had slipped aside to the exact contrary, so that this departure from the good introduced in its train every form of evil to match the good, As for instance, on the defection of life, there was brought in the antagonism of death. On the deprivation of light, darkness supervened. In the absence of virtue, vice arose in its place, and against every form of good might be reckoned a like number of opposite evils. By whom, I ask? Was man fallen by his recklessness into this, and the like evil state? For it was not possible for him to retain even his prudence when he had estranged himself from prudence, or to take any wise counsel when he had severed himself from wisdom. By whom was man to be recalled to the grace of his original state? To whom belonged the restoration of the fallen one, the recovery of the lost, the leading back the wanderer by the hand? To whom else than entirely to him who is the Lord of his nature? For him only who at the first had given the life was it possible or fitting to recover it when lost. This is what we are taught and learn from the revelation of the truth, that God in the beginning made man and saved him when he had fallen. By the prayers of the holy Theotokos, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and of all the saints, may the Lord Jesus Christ our God have mercy on us and save us. Amen.